At 9:14 in the morning on a Tuesday in March, inside the West Wing of the White House, a decision was made that career diplomats would later describe, in private, to people familiar with their conversations, as one of the most strategically incoherent acts of economic self-sabotage in the modern history of American foreign policy. It wasn't triggered by an intelligence report. It wasn't the result of months of deliberation by trade experts or national security advisors. It was triggered by a television advertisement, a 30-second political ad that ran in Canada, paid for by a Canadian political party, showing footage of Donald Trump speaking in his own words about absorbing Canada into the United States as its 51st state. That ad, that single, completely unremarkable piece of campaign media in a foreign country's domestic election, caused the President of the United States to personally cancel scheduled trade negotiations with America's largest trading partner, its closest military ally, and the country that shares the longest undefended border on the face of the earth. And tonight, what is happening in the aftermath of that cancellation is something that three former senior trade negotiators, speaking on background to sources familiar with the situation, are calling the most significant strategic realignment in the Canada-US relationship since the free trade agreements of the late 1980s. Because the man who just won Canada's election, Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, one of the most credentialed economic minds ever to hold elected office anywhere in the Western world, has looked at what Donald Trump did, absorbed it completely, and is now executing a response that is methodical, internationally coordinated, and, according to two people briefed on internal Canadian government planning, specifically designed to maximize economic and diplomatic pressure at the precise moments when the American economy is most vulnerable. If you have been watching this channel, you know that we have been tracking the deterioration of the Canada-US relationship for months. But what is happening right now is different. This is no longer deterioration. This is a rupture. And the consequences of this rupture, for American consumers, for American manufacturers, for American farmers, and for the long-term credibility of American diplomacy with every allied nation watching, are only beginning to come into focus. Stay with this video all the way through, because in the next 25 minutes, we are going to walk through exactly how we got here, who the key players are, what they are actually trying to accomplish, and what the next 60 days are going to look like for both countries. And if this is the kind of deep, sourced, consequential reporting you come here for, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is moving fast and we are going to be on top of every development as it unfolds. Let's go back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with the television ad. It starts much earlier, and understanding where it starts is the only way to understand how completely avoidable this crisis was, and how deliberately it has been made worse by choices made at the highest levels of the American government. The foundation of the Canada-US trade relationship is the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA, which replaced NAFTA and was, in a remarkable historical irony, one of the signature first-term achievements of Donald Trump himself. Trump spent years attacking NAFTA as a disaster, a betrayal of American workers, the worst trade deal ever made. And then his administration negotiated the USMCA, which his own trade representatives described as a modernized, improved framework for North American economic integration. Canada signed it. Mexico signed it. Trump signed it. The United States Senate ratified it with bipartisan support. It went into effect on July 1, 2020. The USMCA includes a built-in review mechanism. Every 6 years, the three countries are required to conduct a formal joint review of the agreement's implementation and determine whether to continue it, modify it, or renegotiate it. That review was scheduled to begin in 2026. And in the months leading up to that review, the expectation among trade professionals in all three countries, the people who actually work on these agreements, who understand the legal frameworks and the tariff schedules and the rules of origin provisions at a granular level, was that this would be a technical, professional, largely routine process. It might produce some modifications. Some provisions might be updated. But the fundamental architecture of North American trade, which supports approximately 3.6 million American jobs directly tied to Canadian trade alone, according to figures cited by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, would remain intact. That expectation began to fracture the moment the Trump administration returned to power in January 2025. Within weeks of the inauguration, the administration announced tariffs on Canadian goods, not as a negotiating position within the USMCA review framework, but as a unilateral executive action, justified initially on national security grounds related to fentanyl trafficking. The fentanyl justification was immediately questioned by trade analysts because the vast majority of fentanyl entering the United States crosses through the southern border, not the northern one. According to publicly available data from U.S. Customs and Border Protection covering the 12 months prior to the tariff announcement, seizures of fentanyl at the Canadian border represented less than 1% of total fentanyl interdictions. Canada itself had virtually no fentanyl trafficking problem relative to the Mexican corridor that was the actual source of the crisis. But the tariffs went on anyway. 25% on most Canadian goods. And the Canadian government, led at the time by Justin Trudeau in the final weeks of his tenure, responded with retaliatory tariffs of its own, carefully targeted, according to 3 sources with direct knowledge of the internal deliberations inside the Canadian Finance Ministry, to maximize political pain in specific American congressional districts while minimizing harm to Canadian consumers. They went after American orange juice from Florida, American bourbon from Kentucky, American motorcycles from Wisconsin. These were not random choices. They were surgical. Canada had done this before, during the steel and aluminum tariff disputes of Trump's first term, and they understood exactly which American industries to pressure to generate congressional pushback in Washington. If you appreciate the level of detail and context we bring to these stories every single day, please take a moment right now and hit that like button. It helps more people find this reporting, and in a media environment full of noise and spin, this kind of substantive analysis depends on your support to reach the audience that needs to hear it. Now here is where the story takes a turn that even experienced diplomatic observers found genuinely surprising. Because the escalation of tariffs and retaliatory measures was itself not unprecedented. Trade disputes between close allies happen. They get managed. There are formal dispute resolution mechanisms built into the USMCA precisely for this purpose. The working assumption among diplomats and trade lawyers on both sides was that even if the rhetoric got heated, even if the tariffs created short-term pain, the economic interdependence between the two countries, the shared supply chains, the integrated manufacturing, the $900 billion in annual bilateral trade, would eventually pull both sides back toward negotiation and resolution. Then came the television ad. Mark Carney, running for the leadership of the Liberal Party of Canada, and then for Prime Minister in a snap election called after Trudeau's resignation, authorized a campaign advertisement that used Donald Trump's own publicly recorded statements. Statements Trump had made in press conferences, in social media posts, in conversations with journalists. Statements in which Trump had described Canada as the 51st state, had suggested that the only thing keeping Canada from becoming part of the United States was an artificial line, had called the Canadian Prime Minister the governor of the great state of Canada. These were not fabrications. They were not distortions. They were direct recordings of the President of the United States, in his own voice, saying things he had actually said. The ad ran in Canada. It was a Canadian political advertisement in a Canadian election about a Canadian policy position, specifically Carney's position that Canada needed a leader who would stand firm against American economic coercion rather than accommodate it. The ad resonated powerfully with Canadian voters, who were, according to polling conducted by the Angus Reid Institute in late February 2026, experiencing record high levels of anti-American sentiment driven directly by the tariff disputes and the annexation rhetoric. Favorable views of the United States among Canadians had dropped to 38%, the lowest figure recorded in the history of that particular survey, which had been running for more than 2 decades. When Donald Trump saw the advertisement, according to multiple people familiar with the sequence of events inside the White House, his reaction was immediate and visceral. Within hours of the ad circulating on social media, Trump posted on Truth Social that Canada was disrespecting the United States, that the Liberals were running an anti-American hate campaign, and that he saw no point in engaging in trade discussions with a country that was using his image in political propaganda. And then, according to a senior administration official speaking on background to a reporter at a major financial news outlet, Trump personally directed the cancellation of a scheduled preliminary meeting between U.S. and Canadian trade officials that had been set for the following week. A meeting that was intended to begin the process of establishing parameters for the USMCA review. The meeting was cancelled. No rescheduling date was provided. The Canadian Embassy in Washington was informed through a brief written communication. No explanation beyond what Trump had posted publicly. No off-ramp. No invitation to discuss the situation through back channels. Just cancellation. And with that single decision, driven not by any substantive policy dispute, not by any new intelligence assessment, not by any formal review of American trade interests, but by anger over a television commercial in another country's election, the United States unilaterally walked away from the table on the most important bilateral trade relationship in the Western Hemisphere. This is the point in the story where we need to talk about Mark Carney, because if you are going to understand what happens next, you need to understand who this man is, what he has spent his career doing, and why the people around him, including some who are not naturally sympathetic to his politics, privately express a kind of institutional, or at the precision of what he is now doing in response. Mark Carney is not a politician in the conventional mold. He did not rise through party ranks. He did not spend decades working in legislatures or running for local office. He spent his career at Goldman Sachs, then in the Canadian Civil Service, then as Governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, the period that included the global financial crisis, where his management of Canadian monetary policy was credited by international economists with producing the softest landing of any G7 economy during that period. Canada did not require a bank bailout. Canada did not experience the catastrophic unemployment spikes that hit the United States and United Kingdom. And a significant portion of the credit for that outcome went to the technocratic discipline and institutional steadiness of Mark Carney. Then, in an almost unprecedented move for a central banker, he was recruited by the British government to serve as Governor of the Bank of England, the foreigner, leading Britain's central bank, during the period that included Brexit and its economic turbulence. He served there from 2013 to 2020. When he left, the editorial boards of major British newspapers wrote pieces about him that used words like indispensable and steady. The Financial Times, not given to hyperbole, described his tenure as a demonstration of institutional competence under extraordinary political pressure. This is not a man who responds to provocation with provocation. This is a man who has spent 30 years in institutions where the premium is on calibrated, strategic response, where you understand your leverage, you understand your counterpart's vulnerabilities, and you move deliberately and with maximum effect. And according to 3 sources familiar with the internal planning inside the Carney government's transition team in the weeks following his election victory, the response being prepared to Trump's cancellation of trade talks is being designed according to exactly that logic. What Carney recognized, what his economic training and his institutional experience had prepared him to see clearly, was that the cancellation of the trade talks was not actually a strengthening of the American position. It was a weakening of it. Because the United States needed the USMCA review to go well, American manufacturers who rely on Canadian aluminum and steel needed it. American automotive companies whose supply chains cross the border dozens of times in the production of a single vehicle needed it. American farmers who export agricultural products to Canada needed it. The Americans who needed the trade relationship to stabilize and continue are not abstract. They were specific, identifiable, politically organized constituencies with Republican senators and Republican congresspeople who were already receiving calls from industry associations expressing alarm about where the bilateral relationship was heading. The cancellation, in other words, had created leverage for Canada. Not immediately, not obviously, but structurally. And Mark Carney, the man who managed monetary policy during the 2008 financial crisis while other economies were in free fall, understood leverage. Make sure you are subscribed right now, not because we are asking as a formality, but because what is about to unfold in this bilateral relationship over the next 60 days is going to move faster than most people realize, and you are going to want to have followed this story from the beginning when the full picture comes into view. Here is what has happened since the cancellation, and here is where this story accelerates into territory that even close observers of Canadian-American relations have described as genuinely unprecedented. Within 72 hours of the cancellation, Mark Carney was on a plane. Not to Washington, to Brussels, and then to London. And then, according to sourcing from a reporter covering the diplomatic circuit for a major European newspaper, to a meeting in Paris that was not officially on any public schedule, and that Canadian government spokespeople declined to comment on specifically when asked about its contents. What Carney was doing, according to two people briefed on the substance of those conversations, was executing a diplomatic strategy that had clearly been in preparation for some time, a strategy built around the recognition that if the United States was going to use economic coercion as a foreign policy tool against its closest allies, those allies needed to develop alternatives. Not alternatives that would replace the American relationship, that was neither realistic nor the goal, but alternatives that would reduce the catastrophic leverage that complete dependency on a single, increasingly erratic partner creates. Alternatives that would give Canada, and by extension the broader alliance of democratic trading partners, genuine options. In Brussels, Carney met with European Commission leadership and reportedly reopened conversations about a bilateral Canada-EU trade enhancement that would deepen the existing CETA agreement, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between Canada and the European Union. In London, he met with the Prime Minister and senior Treasury officials about accelerating financial cooperation and mutual recognition frameworks that would make it easier for Canadian businesses to access European capital markets. In Paris, according to sources familiar with those conversations, he participated in a broader discussion about what a coordinated Allied response to American tariff coercion would look like, the conversation that included, among other things, the possibility of coordinated investment redirections away from U.S. Treasury instruments in ways that would signal clearly to American bond markets that the era of unconditional Allied financial cooperation had limits. That last point deserves to be stated clearly, because if it is accurate, it represents an escalation of a kind that goes far beyond anything Canada has done before in a trade dispute with the United States. Canada currently holds approximately $340 billion in U.S. Treasury securities, according to the most recent Treasury International Capital data available. That is not a trivial number. And the suggestion that allied nations might begin coordinating their behavior in U.S. debt markets as a response to American trade coercion is the kind of thing that makes people at the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department sit up very straight. Multiple people briefed on the situation caution that this remains a possibility rather than a confirmed policy decision. But the fact that it is being discussed, that it has moved from theoretical to active diplomatic conversation, is itself significant. Because it tells you something about how seriously allied governments are now taking the question of whether the old rules of the relationship with Washington still apply. Let's pause here for a moment and talk about the domestic political dimension of this story, because it is inseparable from the diplomatic one, and it is where some of the most consequential developments are now taking place. In the United States Congress, the reaction to the cancellation of trade talks with Canada has not been uniformly supportive of the White House position. That is a significant understatement. According to reporting from multiple congressional correspondents in Washington, the Republican senators from states with the largest economic exposure to Canadian trade, senators from Michigan, from Ohio, from Minnesota, from Montana, have been receiving a volume of industry lobbying pressure that, according to one congressional staffer speaking on background, is unlike anything I have seen since the debates over the original NAFTA in the 1990s. The automotive industry alone has made clear, through its trade associations and through direct conversations with congressional offices, that the continuation of the current tariff regime, combined with the collapse of trade negotiations, represents an existential threat to the integrated North American supply chain that underpins American car manufacturing. A vehicle assembled in Detroit crosses the Canadian border an average of 8 times during its production, according to data published by the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. Every time that border crossing becomes more expensive, every time the tariff friction increases, the cost of American-assembled vehicles goes up. And that cost increase is eventually passed to American consumers, who are already demonstrating, according to recent consumer sentiment data from the University of Michigan, historically high anxiety about inflation and the cost of living. If what we are covering today connects to concerns you have been hearing about in your own community, about prices, about economic security, about whether the institutions supposed to be looking out for ordinary Americans are actually doing their jobs, please hit the like button. Because when more people engage with this content, more people find it, and that accountability conversation reaches further. The farm lobby has been equally alarmed. Canadian consumers buy approximately $26 billion worth of American agricultural products every year, making Canada the single largest export market for American farmers. Retaliatory measures by Canada targeting agricultural goods, measures that Canada has the legal and economic capacity to deploy under the existing tariff dispute framework, would land with devastating impact on American farming communities that are already operating on razor-thin margins and that have been among the most loyal political constituencies of the current administration. These are not abstractions. These are real farmers, real manufacturers, real workers, and their representatives in Congress are beginning to say, with increasing directness, that the administration needs to get back to the table. According to 2 Senate Republican aides speaking on background, there have been private conversations among Republican senators about whether a formal resolution expressing support for resuming trade talks should be introduced, not as a rebuke of the president, the aides were careful to say, but as a signal of congressional equities in the outcome of the bilateral relationship. Now we need to talk about what happens next. Because the timeline here is compressed, and the decision points are approaching faster than most public commentary has recognized. The first critical moment comes within the next 30 days. Canada's retaliatory tariff framework, which has been maintained at a measured level since the initial exchange earlier this year, is scheduled for a formal review by the Canadian Cabinet. According to multiple people familiar with the structure of that review, Carney has the option at that point to do one of 3 things: maintain the current measures, escalate them significantly to increase pressure on American industries with political leverage, or offer a partial suspension as a good faith gesture to reopen negotiations. Which of those options Carney chooses will depend substantially on whether there is any signal from Washington of willingness to return to the table. The second critical moment comes at the G7 summit, which is scheduled for mid-2026. The G7 brings together the leaders of Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and Canada holds the presidency of the G7 this year. That means Mark Carney is not just attending that summit. He is hosting it. He controls the agenda. He sets the framework for what gets discussed and how. And according to sources familiar with early G7 planning conversations, Carney intends to use that platform to elevate the question of allied economic sovereignty and the rules governing trade relationships between democratic nations, a conversation that will, unavoidably, place the American position at the center of discussion with every other G7 leader present. That is leverage of an entirely different order. Not financial leverage, not trade leverage, but the leverage of a multilateral forum in which the United States has historically been the convener and the presumptive leader, being used by the host nation to put American behavior on the agenda. It has happened before, but rarely. And the fact that it is happening now, between two countries that have been the closest of allies for more than a century, is a measure of how dramatically the relationship has changed. The third critical moment is the USMCA review itself. The formal review process has a legal timeline. It cannot simply be cancelled. It must happen, or the agreement enters a period of legal uncertainty that would be damaging to all parties. But the process requires active participation from all three signatories. If the United States continues to refuse to engage, if the cancellation of the preliminary meeting is followed by further refusals to negotiate, the review process stalls, and the agreement's legal status enters territory that trade lawyers describe, in public briefings, as genuinely uncharted. What happens in uncharted legal territory in international trade? According to three trade law experts, whose analysis has appeared in peer-reviewed journals and major financial publications, the most likely outcome is not a clean rupture, but a messy, prolonged dispute process in which individual provisions of the agreement are challenged, litigated, and adjudicated through multiple parallel mechanisms, a process that creates maximum uncertainty for businesses making investment and hiring decisions, which tends to depress economic activity on both sides of the border while producing essentially no policy clarity. In other words, everyone loses. The American companies that depend on clear, predictable trade rules lose. The Canadian companies that built their business models on integrated North American supply chains lose. The American workers whose jobs depend on export relationships with Canada lose. The only people who don't obviously lose are the ones who can portray the resulting chaos as someone else's fault, and that, of course, is a calculation that political actors are making right now in both Ottawa and Washington. Stay with us through the end of this video, because what we are about to lay out, the four scenarios now on the table and what each of them means for you, is the part of this story that every American with savings, with a pension, with any financial stake in how this economy performs over the next 2 years, needs to understand. There is one more element of this story that has received almost no coverage in American media, and it is arguably the most consequential development of all. It involves the energy relationship between the United States and Canada, a relationship so fundamental to American energy security that its disruption would be felt by every household in the country, though almost no one in the public conversation has connected these dots yet. Canada is the single largest supplier of foreign oil to the United States. Approximately 4 million barrels per day cross the border through a network of pipelines that represents one of the most critical pieces of energy infrastructure on the continent. The oil comes primarily from Alberta's oil sands, moves through pipelines operated by companies on both sides of the border, and supplies refineries in the American Midwest and Gulf Coast that are specifically configured to process that particular grade of crude. They cannot easily switch to alternative sources. The refinery infrastructure was built for Canadian heavy crude, and converting it to process lighter crude from other regions would require billions of dollars in capital investment and years of construction time.